Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to your biology class. And today we are going to talk a little bit about um, cell organelles. Specifically, we're going to talk a little bit about the external structure of the cells. And in this video, we're only going to talk about a couple of the internal structures. The first thing we're going to talk about, or the first thing we're going to mention, is that cell eukaryotic cells. Excuse me for a minute. Let me get this organized and up and running for you guys. All right. So the first thing we're going to talk about is that the eukaryotic cell is very well organized, or is well organized. It has a lot of specialized structures. And two important things to mention about the eukaryotic cell is that number one, they are surrounded by a protective membrane. Are surrounded by a protective membrane um, that receives messages from other cells. That receives messages from other cells. And also, they contain membrane bound organelles. They contain membrane bound organelles that perform specific processes or specific cellular processes. Cellular processes. Okay. So one is that eukaryotic cells are really organized. They're surrounded by a protective membrane that kind of helps it maintain communication with the outside of the cell, and they also have specialized organelles that or they have membrane bound organelles, excuse me, that help them perform certain cellular processes. So we're going to talk about some of those organelles in this video. We're going to talk about some of the structures that are in the cell. And the first thing we're going to talk about is the cytoskeleton. So the first organism that we're going to talk about is the cytoskeleton. And let's define cytoskeleton real quick. And cytoskeleton is a network of proteins of proteins that is constantly changing to meet the needs of the cells. So the cytoskeleton is a network of proteins that is constantly changing to meet the needs of the cell. And we're going to talk about the structures that, or the proteins that make up the cytoskeleton. The first one that we're going to talk about are the microtubules. So that's the first protein that makes up the cytoskeleton, is the microtubules. And microtubules give the cell its shape. So the microtubules give the cell its shape. The second set of proteins that forms the cytoskeleton is the intermediate filaments. And the filaments, or the intermediate filaments, give a cell its strength. So they give Lastly, the other structure or protein is the microfilaments. The microfilaments enable cell to move and divide. Enable cells to move and divide. So basically, what microfilaments do, or where they're seen as well, is in muscle cells. I realized I just wrote 1, 2, 4, but you guys get the drift. It's 1, 2, 3. And let's continue on to talk about some of the other structures. So we spoke about the. Give me 1 second, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so the next thing that we're going to talk about, ladies and gentlemen, is the cytoplasm. Okay, so we talked about the cytoskeleton, which is basically the outside of the cell, and we're kind of looking at it from an outside to inside approach. So we talked about the cytoskeleton, and we said that the cytoskeleton is formed of three things: the microtubule, which give the cell its shape; the intermediate filaments, which give the cell its strength; and the microtubules, which allow the cell to move and to divide. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about is we're going to kind of give a general description of the cytoplasm, although we kind of already did it in a previous video and whatnot. But basically, cytoplasm is um, contributes to the cell's structure. So cytoplasm contributes to the cell's structure. And it says that in eukaryotes, or in eukaryotic cell, in eukaryote, it fills the space between the nucleus and the cell membrane. So in eukaryotes, it fills the space between the nucleus and the cell membrane. And we're going to talk about the nucleus now. Okay, so the cytoplasm contributes to the cell structure, and in eukaryotes, it fills the space between the nucleus and the cell membrane. Now we're going to talk about the nucleus, a very specific structure or part inside the cytoplasm. And let's talk about the nucleus. So what we're going to do is we're going to give some traits about the nucleus. We're going to kind of break it down here because there's a lot of things. It's considered the storehouse for most of the genetic information. So is considered the storehouse for most of the genetic information. And basically it contains, so that's one. Let me just kind of like write them down. So no, I'm sorry for the. So one is it's considered the storehouse of the it's considered the storehouse for most of the genetic information. Two is that DNA, or rather, I'm sorry, the two major demands dimensions of the nucleus are, and let me erase this right here. So there are two main, not main functions, but two very important aspects that the nucleus needs to be able to perform in the cell. So we already spoke that it's considered the storehouse of the genetic information, which of course are very important in terms of the information that our cells have. But the other thing is that one, DNA must be carefully protected. So the nucleus has to carefully protect the DNA. The two main demands are one, it must carefully protect the DNA. And two, DNA must be available for use at the proper time. So it has to keep the DNA accessible. DNA must be available for use at the proper time. Those are the two main demands of the DNA, of the nucleus. There are other traits that we're going to talk about real quick. And the first thing is that the special structure of the nucleus helps it meet the demands. The nucleus is composed, and here's another thing. Here are some other traits about the nucleus. The nucleus is composed of the cell's DNA enclosed in a double membrane called the nuclear envelope. So the nucleus is composed of the cell's DNA of the cell's DNA is composed of the cell's DNA enclosed in a double membrane closed in a double membrane called the nuclear envelope. Enclosed in the nuclear envelope. Enclosed in the nuclear envelope. It says the nucleus is composed of the cell's DNA. The nucleus is composed of the cell's DNA enclosed in a double membrane called the nuclear envelope. And what does the nuclear envelope do? I guess you're wondering. So let's write right here what the nuclear envelope does and what it's responsible for. The nuclear envelope is pierced with holes. So the nuclear envelope is pierced with holes called pores. Called pores that allow large molecules to pass between the nucleus and the cytoplasm. So let's kind of sum it up real quick. So we have the cytoplasm, which, if we go back to this part, says in eukaryotic cells, it fills the space between the nucleus and the cell membrane. We talked about the nucleus, and we said that the nucleus is considered the storehouse for most of the genetic information. The nucleus has two demands, and one is that it carefully protects the DNA, and two is that the DNA must be available for use at the proper time. Third is that the nucleus is composed of the cell's DNA enclosed in a nuclear envelope. And we just talked about the nuclear envelope, and we just said that the nuclear envelope is pierced with holes called pores that allow large molecules to pass between the cytoplasm and the nucleus. Okay, or between the nucleus and the cytoplasm. And within the nucleus, we also have the nucleolus. So we're going to talk about real quick about the nucleolus. And the nucleolus, the nucleo, sorry guys, nucleolus, nucleolus is a dense region with where tiny organelles, where tiny organelles, tiny organelles essential for making proteins are assembled. So here's where structures like the ribosomes and other organelles that are important in protein synthesis are structured. Now, speaking of the ribosome, that's the next thing we're going to talk about. So real quick, okay, the nucleolus is a dense region where tiny organelles essential for making proteins are assembled. These organelles, called ribosomes, are a combination of proteins and and RNA. Excuse me. They are they're discussed in the next page, or another. We're going to discuss them in a minute. And it says and are a more complete. Um, okay, so basically, in the nucleolus is where the ribosomes are found, and the ribosomes are very important in protein synthesis. So again, the nucleolus is a dense region where tiny organelles essential for making proteins are assembled. Now let's talk about the ribosomes real quick. So we're almost done with this video lesson for today. The first thing we're going to do is we're going to basically define what the endoplasmic reticulum is and what the ribosomes is. And in our next video lesson, we'll give more of the details of the ribosomes. So let me clear all this. And it says what we're going to talk about is the endoplasmic reticulum. Okay, and it says is an interconnected network of thin folded membranes. Okay, so let's talk about the endoplasmic reticulum. Endoplasmic reticulum is also referred to as the ER, but the endoplasmic reticulum is an interconnected network of thin folded membranes. Is an interconnected network of thin folded membranes. Of thin folded membranes. There's an internal structure in the or ribosome in the endoplasmic reticulum, the ER. I think it's easier to call it that way. The ER is, or the ER form mazes of enclosed spaces. So inside within the endoplasmic reticulum, there are spaces, or there are mazes of enclosed spaces called the lumen. And um, the production of proteins and lipids, and this structure is important because um, the the synthesis of proteins and lipids occur both on the surface of the endoplasmic reticulum, on the surface of the endoplasmic reticulum, and inside of the lumen. So the endoplasmic reticulum um, is basically an connected network of thin folded membranes. And inside of the endoplasmic reticulum, there are mazes, which are called the lumen. And the lumen, along with the surface of the ER, are important in the synthesis of proteins and lipids. And speaking of proteins and speaking of synthesis and lipids, the last thing we're going to talk about is the ribosomes or ribosomes. Okay. And the ribosomes, um, pretty much for now, we're gonna say that ribosomes and let me write it here. The ribosomes or ribosomes can be defined as the organelle in which or where protein synthesis occurs. And again, this is a very vague definition of ribosomes. We're going to talk a little, or ribosomes, we're going to talk a little bit later on in more in detail into them. But it says, and I'm quoting for your book. It says ribosomes, tiny organelles that link amino acids together to form proteins. Okay. So ribosomes are tiny organelles that link amino acid together. As I think this is a better definition. Can be defined as tiny organelles that link amino acids together. That link amino acids together to form proteins. To form proteins. So basically, it's in the ribosomes where protein synthesis occurs. And of course, there are other functions and structures for the ribosomes that we're going to talk about in our next video lesson. So hopefully this video is helpful to help you review or refresh some of those concepts that were discussed in class. So until we see each other in our next class, stay safe and enjoy the rest of your day. So bye-bye.